GBH and the Bill of Rights Institute are teaming up tonight to discuss voting processes and rights, elections, and civic responsibilities, and to share a variety of engaging classroom-ready resources for exploring these topics with students in grades 6 through 12. This session is in collaboration with NCSS, the National Council for the Social Studies, and Keely is here from NCSS, and she'd like to say a few words of welcome.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Keely. I'm from the National Council for the Social Studies and thrilled to be here with everyone this evening. And I would just like to give a shout out to our annual conference that is coming up in November. So if you'd like to learn more about NCSS and more importantly about our conference, visit us at socialstudies.org/conference. We have some amazing sessions for professional development for social studies teachers coming up. And some of our keynote speakers this year, we have Ken Burns, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Eric Liu, Ned Blackhawk, and Ta-Nehisi Coates. We're thrilled to have that lineup and more. Those are just a handful of our keynotes and featured speakers. So we also have some film panels, vital issue sessions, just basically everything you could want and more when it comes to a social studies conference, ranging from elementary ed all the way into higher education. So we hope to see you there. And if you have any questions, I'll be hanging out in the chat. So if you have any questions about NCSS or our conference, of course, I'll be hanging out in the chat. And thank you again for joining us tonight. Back to you, Sue. Thank you.
Great. GBH, Boston's public media station, is the largest producer of digital and broadcast media for PBS. I hope folks are familiar with us. You may recognize some of our productions like Arthur or Molly of Denali, which are children's programs, of course, and American Experience, Frontline, and Nova for general audience. GBH Education is part of the GBH family, and for more than 40 years, we've produced educational materials and media for pre-K to 12 audiences. We create media resources and programs for both the formal classroom and informal learning spaces. With PBS, we co-founded and co-manage PBS LearningMedia, public media's digital learning service. There are thousands of free, standards-aligned videos, interactives, and lesson plans spanning all subjects for K-12 teachers and students. At pbslearningmedia.org, you'll find all of the GBH resources highlighted in tonight's webinar. They come from our newly launched Civics collection, but there's much more than just great social studies and civics content on the site. There's something for every discipline and grade level as well. So we encourage you, if you haven't been to this site, to explore and see what we have there. The newly launched Civics collection is designed to support teachers and students with media-rich resources that teach foundational civics knowledge, resources that apply that civics knowledge to real-world situations, events, and movements, and resources that support students to be civically engaged in their communities. And this slide is just sort of outlining our process that went into building this collection over the past 2 years. The Civics collection is available now on pbslearningmedia.org, and we'll be adding additional resources to it through the end of this year. So please visit again to see what is new if you haven't been there already. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's presenters. Lindsay Galveo, Social Studies Curriculum Specialist at GBH and moderator for tonight's conversation. Alicia Butler, Senior Manager, Inclusive Social Studies Curriculum at GBH and a full-time history teacher in Washington, D.C. Rachel Humphreys, Senior Director, Civic Learning Initiatives at the Bill of Rights Institute, and Joe Schmidt, Director of Programs at the Bill of Rights Institute. Welcome to you all as well. These 4 topics form the framework for tonight's conversation. And I'm now going to turn things over to Rachel and Joe so they can introduce the Bill of Rights Institute to you.
Well, I can't tell you how excited we are to be here. I grew up with GBH watching Nova and different programs as I was a child growing up, and I've loved this collaboration. So the Bill of Rights Institute, we're a mission-driven organization that supports history and civics teachers across the country for the past 25 years. We're actually entering our 25th year, and our mission is simple. We teach history and civics. We equip students and teachers to live the ideals of a free and just society. We have a ton of different resources that we support educators with. You can go to the next slide. Including community activities, professional development resources that Joe helps manage, leadership opportunities. Joe, do you want to talk a little bit about all the different opportunities that teachers have to work with the Bill of Rights Institute?
Sure, absolutely. Besides doing trainings across the country, this year probably more than 200 trainings across the country in support of more than 6,000 free online resources. We make sure that we find ways to support our network of more than 76,000 educators. So if you get a newsletter from us, if you've ever been to one of our trainings, you're in our network, and we're always looking for individuals in that network to provide feedback on the trainings we develop, the resources that we develop, anything we're creating. We always make sure that we talk to teachers about it to make sure it makes sense for you all. And sometimes we have more formal processes like teacher fellowships. We've had teachers councils, and we're always just looking for ways to make sure that we're recognizing the great things that teachers are doing and make sure that we can share that awesomeness with everybody across the country.
Thanks. And next slide, Sue. So we know that your students learn in a myriad of ways at the Bill of Rights Institute, and we really do focus on history and civics. That's our bread and butter. That's what we do. All of our resources are steeped in what we call the constitutional principles and virtues. We'll talk about that in a little bit. That's our design framework. It's what makes BRI BRI is when you come to us, you know that they're going to be principles-based resources. But we also have a ton of professionally learning designed resources that include essays and videos and lessons. You can go to the next slide. Joe mentioned the over 6,000 free resources on our website. They're ready for you. They focus mostly on 7th through 12th grade, but we've actually just released our first group of 3 to 5 resources. So we have 10 lessons, 10 really robust lessons, more like units for 3rd through 5th grade educators. And they span all the different things you might want to talk about with your students, really well scaffolded, searchable by different periods and grade levels, duration, topic, document-based questions, Socratic discussions, background essays, all of it freely available for you on our website. You're going to be receiving a follow-up email with a bunch of links. You can sign up on our website, billofrightsinstitute.org, for access to the answer keys, but everything else is in front of a paywall, so you can just link to it as you need. Joe, did I miss anything?
No, I just always say that we're not really good salespeople, that we basically give you everything for free, which isn't the best approach to it, but that's always our goal. We just want to make sure you have as much access to as many of these materials as you could possibly need in your classrooms.
Back to you, Sue.
Thank you. And yeah, it's so great to share tonight with you, BRI, because we're free at GBH as well on PBS Learning Media. So fantastic. Yes. So tonight here for this webinar, we're going to talk about a myriad of things. And we wanted to quickly explain our why behind our webinar this evening. Our goal tonight is to provide educators with a comprehensive overview of how to discuss elections in your classroom, especially during an election cycle. And we also wanted to make sure that you don't feel the pressure to necessarily focus all of your attention on the federal election during an election cycle. So we really hope that this webinar will be a great starting point for you to start engaging your students in civic knowledge, to start seeing the presidential election as a starting point or an opportunity for perspective taking, as a way to look at history and some pretty historic elections, and also help your students look forward toward the future. So what's guiding us tonight in this election is a few different things. We are looking to equip teachers to take a comprehensive approach to teaching U.S. history and U.S. elections. We are going to discuss civic virtues that all students should have. We're going to help teachers guide students through divisiveness and polarization that can come during a national election by looking at some historic elections and seeing what lessons can be learned. And then again, we're going to look at different avenues to explore outside of voting that can civically engage students through an election cycle. There are several questions that will be guiding our webinar tonight. We're going to be delving in some of these questions. And don't worry about taking any notes. You're going to have access to all these slides after the webinar. So I want to turn my first question of the evening. Again, as Sue mentioned, I'll be moderating a conversation. I want to turn it over to Rachel and Joe, our friends at BRI. We have a very specific way of electing our president that, I don't necessarily want to discuss right now. I want to delve into that a little bit later tonight. But first, before we start kind of talking about the nitty-gritty of how we conduct elections, I wanted to think a little bit more broadly about how elections connect to the principles of American democracy. So, Rachel and Joe, why are elections and voting so integral to our constitutional democracy?
Well, I think the first thing to know, and Joe and I are going to kind of bounce around here a little bit, but the first thing to know is that America holds more elections than almost any other democracy in the world. Because of the federalism and decentralization that we have, there are more offices for the electorate to fill and thus more elections. Federalism is the core reason that we have so many elections. And this means that our political power is distributed. And that's an important part of how we think about ourselves, is that we don't, when we have a big presidential election, yes, it's an important election, but there are thousands of smaller elections that are also happening across the country at the exact same time. And that, very large number means that Americans need to vote more often. We need the input for all of these different offices. And the reason that we are designed that way is because this idea, of popular sovereignty, that the government derives its power from the consent of the governed. And in elections, that's the formal way that we exercise the power of voting. So, things like rule of law and checks and balances and individual rights are all really integral to what it means to have a democratic republic, and what it means to be an American citizen. So at the Bill of Rights Institute, we think about this a lot, and we use not only the principles of self-governance, but also this idea that in order to be a self-governing person, you have to cultivate certain characteristics in yourself. Integrity, moderation, justice, prudence, respect. Those are essential qualities that allow us to have transitions of power and significant authority that we give over, because it's well reasoned and well considered. Joe, do you want to add anything to this part of the conversation?
I mean, I know, politics are politics, and, we live in a world right now with polarization and divisiveness. But I think, like, if you look at the list of virtues, the Bill of Rights Institute focuses on, these are virtues that, really, it's across the spectrum that I think most Americans believe in: justice, integrity, courage, respect. And that's the way, like, if we're thinking about the power of elections at the local level, we're looking for people that share some of those values. And again, if these are some of the shared values that we have, this means that not only is Washington, D.C. maybe a very far place, and maybe, you'll never get a chance to meet the president, but there's a good chance you'll get to meet your mayor, or you'll get to meet your city council person or school board, right? Like, because there's so many layers in the election, in the United States, in our democracy, that in the end, we still have some of these core values. And so at the Bill of Rights Institute, we really think about how these values have been reflected not only across time, but then why does that matter today? And Rachel was talking about some of those constitutional principles, and those constitutional principles are lived out by human beings. And those human beings are both voters, and sometimes they're also the elected officials that we are counting on, to make sure that we have the country that we are hoping for.
So the last thing I wanted to say before we close is voting is necessary but not sufficient, right? So elections are the cornerstone of American democracy because they enable these peaceful transitions of power. But and without regular free fair elections, the fundamental principles like popular sovereignty and individual rights wouldn't be upheld. But it really is about thinking about our role in civil society, right? So how do we foster stronger, more resilient institutions, ensuring that government by the people continues to thrive?
I love this framework. I think it's so helpful to see civic virtues and these values as a starting point. It really talks about what can kind of bring us together, what we have in common, and to use it as a way to begin teaching elections as opposed to just kind of diving into elections. So I think that was really helpful framework. And Rachel, I really liked how you said that voting is necessary but not sufficient. And I wanted to take this as kind of an opportunity to transition into what I was thinking, a direction we could go in next. So, Alicia, we've talked a lot, personally about voting. So, how do you think that voting has been a way to let citizens' voices be known, especially when voters might question the value of their vote? I kind of hear this coming up over and again and again. And I know you've heard some stories about that too, but if you would kind of mind sharing, how has voting been a way for citizens to let their voices be known and heard?
Yeah, voter apathy is an issue that we see not only among people that are of the legal age to vote, but even among our students in the classroom. I see it today with my kids, even with the upcoming election and all of this excitement. I really saw it after I taught recently a lesson on the Constitution in the Electoral College. Many of my students, posed the question, well, why vote? It seems as if my vote doesn't really count. And I have to quickly explain to my students that voting is important. It can be very impactful, and it remains one of the most effective ways to make your voice heard. Elections, they help voters communicate their stance on issues with political parties. Elections force political actions on issues important to the people, and elections can cause political realignments. Now, I love this generation of students because they don't want to just hear it, they want to actually see it. And one great resource we have in the Civics collection to help them visualize it is the New Deal's Political Alignment Interactive Lesson. So, this lesson provides an interactive opportunity for students to explore the shocking political realignment that took place during the 1928 and 1932 election between Harding and Roosevelt. As we all know, before this election, the Republican Party had won most of the presidential elections between 1860 and 1932. However, after 1932, the Democratic Party remained dominant, with the exception of Eisenhower's 2 terms in the White House through 1964. Well, this particular resource uses maps, political cartoons, and intriguing visuals to help students identify the events that caused such a major realignment, to identify which blocks of voters switched party allegiance and why. This resource also incorporates short videos that help to better explain the why and the how, which really resonates with our students. You can see right there. But the great thing about this resource is that before the lesson ends, students are really given the opportunity to actually use what they learned to try to answer the essential question. All right. Next slide. Exploring the causes and the effects of major political realignments not only captures their attention, but also helps them to better understand current election results. It highlights the fact that they have a choice when they go to the polls. It shows them that their choice can have an impact. The interest that students express specifically when discussing what caused the realignment within the African American community during Reconstruction is one of my favorite conversations to have. I found that after learning about the Reconstruction Amendments, students are blown away by the fact that the majority of African Americans during and after Reconstruction were Republicans. And they want to desperately know, how do we go from the image that you're seeing on the screen of your first Black Republican senators to the next slide? The current statistics of Black membership in the Democratic Party and the GOP today, where 78% of Black voters, according to the New York Times last week, lean Democratic, and only about 15% align with the GOP. You know, explaining the why and the how Black people overwhelmingly came to support the Democratic Party really just helps students to realize that their electoral politics do not have to be stagnant. They have a choice in their affiliation, and that choice can have recognizable and long-term effects. We do, however, know from the polling questions for tonight's webinar that teachers also would like to know the mechanics of the election process and what is the Electoral College, how does it work, and why is it controversial? And Lindsay, can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. So thank you first so much, Alicia, because I think it's really important to use history as a way to help students see themselves, a way to empower them and to really show that, yes, your vote does matter. You can make change. It doesn't always feel that way, but realignments in political parties do happen. And so I do want to show you a couple of really fun resources that we have, because when you're teaching about the election process, you do need to have an understanding of the mechanics of the Electoral College. So I have two resources I want to quickly show you this evening. One is called our Electoral Decoder. And what I really like about this is that it's a visual way to see how a state's electoral votes affect the outcome of an election. So what's great about it is you will get the Electoral College breakdown of every presidential election since 1796. And then you also have this cartogram view. And what I really like about the cartogram is that it gives a really great visual representation, because we know that people vote, not land. But if you're looking at a map of the US, students might think, oh, this state is really big. I don't understand why this big state only has, 4 electoral votes. This way, students can really get the visual weight of how the Electoral College works. And I really love this as a tool for especially middle schoolers, really help them with some of that visual literacy and those map skills. When you scroll down in this resource, you'll get facts about the election, a timeline of key events that would have affected the election outcome, and then also related media resources that you could use to give to students or extend your lesson further. And then also, and I think this would be really great to do at some point in your classroom this fall, if you go to menu and click on Presidential Predictor, you can have students come up with their own Electoral College predictions for 2024. And I think it's really fun because then they can kind of see, can you get to exactly 270? How could you get to 269? What are possible states that would have to matter? What does it mean to be a swing state? So they can have all of that. And we always make sure that we provide you tools to implement this in your classroom. And so what we've created on our in our Civics collection for this on our website is something we call an independent student activity that has questions that students can work through. So they can really learn how to dive into the map. They can interact with it. They can examine the Electoral College history of your own state. They can consider the key events that may have led to a certain electoral outcome, and then allow them to see change over time. So that kind of gives the nitty-gritty mechanics. But a lot of you are really interested in having conversations with your students about, why does the Electoral College endure? Or should we have an Electoral College? Or what are critiques of the Electoral College? Or why do we even have an Electoral College? So I just wanted to point out one other resource we have. It's from our video series called Why It Matters. It's a series that uses the past to explain the present. And this video, What is the Electoral College, really goes through what the Electoral College is, why it was created as part of our Constitution, how it works, and then what are some critiques of the Electoral College, which, by the way, people have been critical of the Electoral College since its inception, which would be a great conversation to have with your students. And then also why it's managed to endure. So a lot of you, again, were asking for resources on how to teach the Electoral College. So I hope that this offers you a starting point. You could just take them straight in your classroom even tomorrow. But I want to shift the conversation now a little bit to start thinking, as we've started talking about if your vote matters, and it does matter. I want to start shifting the conversation to who has had the right to vote in this country and how that's shifted through our nation's history and why we need to teach this to our students. So we also know that the right for all citizens to vote has not always existed. It was not put into the Constitution in 1787, and voting rights, again, have changed over time. So, Alicia, how do you think the history of voting rights can be used as an entry point for teaching civics and civic engagement? And how does this history shape the way educators can teach elections?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that, we tend to use the phrase voting is a right and a privilege so much with our students to the point where sometimes I think they kind of get anesthetized to it. And it's a really powerful and very true statement. But if we really want our students to understand the gravity of the statement, it's important that we impress upon them that the fact that, voting has not always been a right that's just been freely given to all in this country, and that voting rights have not always been protected by the federal government. And I really think that helping students to realize that it wasn't just, race, but other factors like your age, your gender, your socioeconomic class or wealth were all factors that, once prevented people from voting, provide support to the argument that voting is both a right and it is a privilege that should not be taken for granted. And I really like this resource that we have, the History of Voting Rights timeline in the Civics collection. It's an interactive timeline that takes students through the evolution of voting rights in the U.S., starting with the ratification of the Constitution and ending with the current competing efforts to suppress voting rights and improve voting access. Students love learning about the key events that have either expanded or suppressed voting rights, as well as the roles that both government institutions and ordinary citizens have played in affecting these changes. It's like I tell my students, if voting didn't matter, you would have many groups in history would not have worked so hard to prevent others from being able to exercise it. Next slide. Resources like She Resisted, one of my favorites, help students to better understand the historical struggle that took place to get the 19th Amendment passed. If you don't mind, I'd like to take a minute just to play the intro to this interactive resource about the fight for suffrage. Now, I don't know about you, but I always love playing that intro for my students, and it immediately grabs their attention. Well, in this particular interactive resource, students can learn more about the individuals and specific strategies that aided in gaining support for the 19th Amendment. My students have used it, and they really enjoy the images and the ease in which they're able to navigate through the different tiles. And the images help to better tell the story behind the movement. Next slide. The accompanying worksheet helps students to stay focused, and it also incorporates graphic organizers for struggling readers. It's also self-guided, so it's an activity where you can truly be a guide and watch your students explore and kind of investigate specific topics about the suffrage movement that really, really interests them. Next slide. It's, however, equally important for students to understand that even when voting rights have been secured, they haven't always been protected. And in many cases, the effects have just been devastating. Having conversations about this topic can be uncomfortable, but it's really necessary. And I find that keeping the discussion anchored in specific historical examples are essential. And the interactive lesson I'm about to show you, entitled "Are Constitutional Rights Always Protected and Enforced?" Students are able to explore a series of historical cases following passage of the 15th Amendment where the federal government failed to protect Black men's right to vote. Students are able to learn about, the Wilmington coup in North Carolina, one of the only successful political coups that occurred in the United States following white supremacist anger at Black and fusionist representation in local politics. But they also learn about the Ocoee Election Day massacre that happened in my hometown of Florida, where white supremacists ransacked an entire prosperous Black community after a Black man attempted to vote. Now, all of these incidents, they're so important because in each situation, the Black population, Black wealth, and Black political representation in local politics still, even to this day, have not fully rebounded. And by teaching students about these incidents, we can not only impress upon them the importance of voting, but also their sense of duty to ensure that voting remains a right that is protected and that it's upheld by the federal government.
Alicia, I just think that's so powerful and a really great way for students to see the importance of going out to vote, and that, again, that they can be empowered to vote, and that people have worked so hard for suffrage in this nation. And I really think that you did a lovely job showing us how history can be that lens and kind of inform us of how we approach looking at voting and our elections. And I want to kind of take more opportunities to start thinking about how we can use history to inform the way that we approach an election cycle. I know that it feels like 2024 is probably something that we haven't seen before. A lot of unprecedented events seem to have happened over the course of this year leading up to the 2024 election. But really, is this election cycle unprecedented? So, Rachel and Joe, I would kind of love if you could walk me through a little bit more about this election cycle. If you can tell me more about how elections might reflect kind of the values of what's happening right now in our democracy. And again, is this something that is new, this election cycle?
I love this conversation, and I think a lot about the fact that even if we're thinking a lot about the 2016 election, our students have no concept of it, right? Like they were not conscious during that period. So this is the first kind of big election, the 2020 election or the 2016 election. This is the first big election for them. It's also the first big election for a lot of our teachers, the first major election. So something to think about there as well is that, yes, elections are the most visible way that a republic manifests itself. They reflect popular sovereignty and the idea of the authority of the government. They enable the mostly peaceful transitions of power that let us choose our leaders. And they're the most important accountability mechanism we have in a republic, right? They affirm or reject the actions of those in power fundamentally. And so I think one of the things that we think about when we think about contentious elections is, no, this isn't the first time. We've had hard periods in American history where we haven't had a lot of unity. There are contentious elections that we can look to kind of see how people navigated them in the past. But elections, the other thing to think about is that, we were talking about the Electoral College and its transitions and its purpose. That's something to help students think about why that might have been the system used, and think about it generously and also ungenerously, right? Like, what are the best reasons why you would have a system of distancing the popular vote from the outcome? And what are the worst reasons that you would have a system that distanced the popular vote from the outcome? In terms
So I
of,
think,
yeah, go ahead,
yeah,
Joe.
I don't jump because I think it's a good point, right? Like if we just think about presidential elections, the ones that are kind of on people's mind right now, like every single election is unique, and every single election still follows these constitutional principles, right? Like we do have an electoral college. And so one of the things I talk about in working with teachers, if you think that this is going to be a close election, if you think, like the popular vote might not match the electoral college vote, if you think like there are things to look at in the past. There are elections where you can go examine this. And if you're going to worry or think about like, okay, well, the day after the election, we may have to do a deep dive into the electoral college, or we may need to do a deep, like you can start front loading some of that now by looking backwards into what we've had. And again, every election is 100% unique and still has these same basic principles in there. We have had an election that had to go to the House of Representatives for dozens and dozens of votes. And I'm looking at all the smart people in the chat. I'm sure somebody will tell me exactly how many votes, there was. Like that's the only time that's happened. But understanding that process could be very, very valuable in understanding this, right? We had an election in 1860 about things going on that we had a civil war, right? And so it's not that we haven't necessarily had these things. It just feels like we haven't had exactly this thing, but the past gives us some roadmaps to kind of use so that you are prepping your students to be the most prepared you can possibly be for whatever unique situation this election might present us with.
Right. And so, I mean, so the Bill of Rights Institute has a ton of different resources for different elections throughout history. We have a playlist that I put in the chat, but we also have an e-lesson on contentious elections and peaceful transitions of power. And we look at specific elections, like the election of 1800, where you had the first peaceful transition of power between Jefferson and Adams, where you had power between two political parties, right? And that America can do it is kind of what 1800 taught us. 1824, Adams versus Jackson, the election was decided in the House of Representatives. That was the one Joe was mentioning, right? Where no candidate won the electoral majority. 1860, Lincoln Breckinridge, in the midst of this intense national division that triggered the Civil War. How elections reflect deep societal divides, but also, again, we've persisted through things that have been really hard in the past. And, I don't know that there was a period harder than the 1860s in the United States. We like to think that the 2020s have been particularly divisive. I would argue that the 1860s were much more so. We have, and then we have the more modern ones. We have the 2000 Bush Gore. That would be a great resource to go through with your students about because they don't remember it. Heck, I was thinking about this in another webinar where some of their parents might not remember the 2000 election at this point. Like middle school parents might not have been conscious of what was going on during the 2000 election. So really bringing that one up and saying, hey, close contested elections have happened relatively recently. There are constitutional processes, while imperfect, they maintain the order in the uncertain times. So if anything, if you're concerned, work to solidify the institutions. And then, of course, the 2016 Trump-Clinton outcome, Clinton winning the popular vote and Trump securing the presidency through the Electoral College. There have been a lot of questions, and you can look at we don't have a lesson on that yet because we have a tendency to wait a few years before we write the lessons. But we do have resources that can help you through that. All of BRI's resources, like we said, are freely available on our website. They're scrolling through some of them. There are links to others. But I think the other thing. Oh, go ahead.
Can I jump in on with it?
Yeah.
What I like, one of my favorite lessons that we have, anybody in the audience, if you use document-based questions, DBQs, primary sources, right? I know all around our civics, government, U.S. history space, like the Bush v. Gore, we have a Supreme Court DBQ for Bush v. Gore, and we're not necessarily trying to argue like the right or wrong of that, right? We're not taking that potentially political stance. We we are giving students the opportunity to use primary sources, both from the founding back to 1776, 1787. We're looking at what's in the Constitution, but then we're also looking at other things going on and asking students, well, as you read this, which of the candidates of their legal teams would use this, like what furthers their argument. So students are having to wrestle with the different perspectives. They're having to think through, okay, well, who's building a case with this? And then they dive into the DBQ, right? That argumentative writing. Okay, well, now let's address this type of stuff. So we're always wanting to support teachers. So we're not just saying like, hey, you should talk about this contentious election. Go, right? We're providing a primary source focused way for students to look at multiple perspectives, to take an informed stance as they're wrestling with this topic. And so as Rachel was saying, like that would be an example if you want to understand some of the legal rulings, if you want to understand some of the things connected to the popular vote or the electoral vote, or if we remember back to hanging chads and dimpled chads and all sorts of chads on the news, right? Here's a way to get students engaged in that fundamental background knowledge of understanding not all of these elections are easy and smooth. Sometimes they're pretty heated and contentious, and we can explore the different ways that has played out in a way that's supporting you as educators to bring them into your classroom. Again, because you're doing historical thinking, you're doing primary source analysis, you're doing argumentative writing, you're really reinforcing the skills that many of you have probably been working on already.
Right. And I think that idea of just having the conversation about contention, and that contention doesn't undermine the Republic. It's we want to live in a free society where we have plurality of opinion. That's a feature, not a bug of the American system. And the contention showcases the resiliency of our institutions. They're designed to handle disputes. We're built for this. Courts, recounts, legal challenges are all part of the process. They're part of the institutions. They're not a hurdle. They're purpose built to give the minority voice the opportunity to be heard. And so peaceful transition of power, even when the results are bitterly contested, are a defining feature of our democracy, right? Of our system of governance, that we have systems built for this because we know it's going to happen, because we want to live in a free, dynamic society that allows for difference of opinion. And so the other thing is just thinking beyond the elections again, like the broader role of civic engagement. While elections are important, we can engage with our communities in lots of other meaningful ways. Civic participation, your voice mattering year-round in non-election civic activities that help sustain our republic and strengthen the community. Elections are more than just a reflection of democratic values. They're the critical means of ensuring accountability, inclusivity, sustainability in our governance. So yes, contentious or unprecedented elections can strain the system, but thus far, history shows that we're built to endure and adapt. A democratic republic isn't just a system of government, it's a way of life that requires us to be active, continuous participation as citizens beyond casting just our ballot.
This has been so great. Hi, Joe, I wrote down that the past gives us roadmaps. I think that's a really great way to think about it. And I like the emphasis of we have a process, right? And so that means lots of different things can happen in the process, but again, you can find these different similarities. I had a teacher tell me this week that we are living in someone's 2035 AP government exam. So I
100%.
I really liked also that perspective, as well as we kind of think about as we're teaching our students that we are imparting critical thinking skills, we're helping them perspective take. I love, again, that you're really diving into these primary sources. That's really great. And we can kind of find those similarities in how we think about elections. And also, if we think elections are only 4 years, as we've all said tonight, we're kind of missing huge opportunities to be engaged. I've been told that democracy is like tending a garden, right? You have to actively always take care of a garden to make it beautiful. Um, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we hit one more big question. Rachel and Joe, you've kind of already hinted at this, but I really want to make sure that we can get students really excited about this election, even if they can't vote yet. So I'm going to start Rachel and Joe. Can you kick us off to think about ways that teachers can engage and excite students around elections when they're too young to actually vote in that election?
Right. Well, I think one of the big things for me is that it's just such an opportunity to help them explore what it means to be a thinking adult, right? So young adults really want to be a part of the conversation. And an election gives them the opportunity to really explore critical thinking. They're a window into complex issues. They encourage students to like analyze the candidates' arguments and platforms in their own debates, discussion. The Bill of Rights Institute recently merged with an organization called Incubate Debate, which has this really brilliant debate approach that allows you to drop it right into your classroom. Debate platforms, we have a toolkit ready for you that can drop right into your classroom. And then also it's the opportunity to help them explore their own views, right? You can guide their understandings of their own values and beliefs. You have reflection exercises. Joe, do you want to jump in there with some ideas?
Yeah. And there's, some comments about, there is a strain in this system, right? And where are we going? And I think one thing that this role can really play with students, even if they can't vote yet, is that there's a lot of stuff out there, especially in recent years, like you can expose students to, like we have a lot in common. We really do. Like the political spectrum, the way things are playing out isn't always matching what we actually feel as students, what we feel in communities. And I think this is also then an opportunity to, even if they're not voting, students can still not only practice the civil discourse and the disagreements, but they can also find their commonalities. Like, even if we disagree on some things, how do we still understand that we are in this together, that we still have more in common than we have have different from one another? Because I think if we can help students learn that and know that when they are able to vote, even if we don't feel like the system is always great right now, that these students can be part of that next phase, next steps in democracy, right? Where they bring us back together. If that's the way you're thinking right now, or if that's where your community's feeling right now, help the students remember what we have in common. And those discussions can take place in the classrooms. They can be the place where we're talking about, sure, the politics, some of the policies, some of those differences. But if we remember that we want a thriving community, that we have things we want to do together, that I think that is maybe almost even more powerful than voting, because then it sets the stage for them to do more than vote. Sure, we hope that they vote in all the times, but Lindsay, like you said, right, it's that garden that needs tending, and we need people to believe that that garden is worth tending, even when it's not a presidential election year.
Right. And a couple more things just to touch on when it comes to engaging students beyond the election, even though they can't, actively participate. The election is this ongoing conversation about governance and fairness and justice. And so thinking about how we can engage students in that larger conversation, even though they can't vote, raising awareness about issues that they care about, engaging in dialogue with friends, connecting it to real world issues. There are a lot of opportunities to say, the election is a gateway to things that you really do care about, right? So how can you contribute to improving your community through non-political means? The Bill of Rights Institute has a national civic engagement contest called the My Impact Challenge, which has a curriculum that gets students able to build their own civic project in their community, or if they're already doing something in their community, we have a national contest where they can win up to $10,000 for their project. It's called the My Impact Challenge, and it can be a government project, so it can be a government initiative that they've worked on. It can be a charitable activity, or it can even be a social enterprise. is because we recognize that there are lots of different solutions to social problems that students identify. And it requires that we take all of the approaches to making sure that students are engaged in their communities. So I think, engaging students beyond the election is the way that we get them excited about elections later on, right? They have to care first. So how do we help them care? And we do that by showing them that they can be change agents in all the myriad communities that they're a part of.
Thank you, Rachel and Joe. That was fantastic. And as we close out our evening, I just wanted to give Alicia the opportunity to answer the same question. You're in the classroom every single day. You are in the trenches. How can we get teachers excited, or how can teachers get students excited about the election if they can't vote yet?
Yeah, like I said, we can't ignore the fact that even with all these compelling stories that we love to tell our students, we're dealing with a population who, for the most part, can't presently vote because a lot of them are not of the age. And I think that really kind of contributes to the voter apathy that we discussed earlier in our webinar. I think that we have to effectively relay the fact that there are so many different ways that you can get involved that don't necessarily require them having to wait until, they are 18. We have to encourage students to pursue issues that are important to them and introduce them to real people from diverse backgrounds who have enacted civic change. Individuals like my favorite, Moctezuma Esparza, who led a coalition of teenagers protesting the unequal treatment of Chicano students in their schools by organizing the 1968 East Los Angeles student walkouts in this great digital video that we have from GBH Education's Youth Stand-Up series. Not only does this resource come with an engaging video, but it's accompanied by a student worksheet that encourages students to analyze how he got started, what were his goals, how did he achieve them, and to what degree they were successful. By introducing students, I firmly believe to people like Moctezuma, they can see themselves and they can get inspired to become politically engaged. I know when I watched his video, I was very inspired myself. So what I'd like to do is to give you all the opportunity. I think we have a little bit of time, perhaps to show a minute or two of the introduction to this very powerful piece that I know that your students will enjoy as much as I did.
My name is Moctezuma Esparza, and I was one of the student leaders when I was 18 years old of the student walkouts of East Los Angeles in March of 1968. I was born and raised in Boyle Heights, which is a neighborhood near downtown Los Angeles. I went to Lincoln High School, and it was a time in the mid-60s when the free speech movement was flourishing, when protest against the Vietnam War was flourishing. The civil rights struggle of African Americans was getting a lot of attention. A group of young Chicano students, we were 10th graders, 11th graders, formed an organization called Young Citizens for Community Action. And we would get together on weekends and we would talk about what was wrong. What was wrong in our schools, what was wrong in our lives, in our community. Why was it that our teachers were not encouraging us to go to college? We had plenty of shop classes at Lincoln, but almost no honors classes. We were being trained to be laborers. The schools were like prisons. We couldn't use the restrooms. We were punished. We were spanked for speaking Spanish. And all of the students were unhappy about that. We talked about what could we do to make a difference.
I hope you got as much chills from that video as I did, Lindsay. And like I said, I think that this is just a great resource to use in our classrooms. And I know that seeing how the impression that it leaves on my students, I'm hoping it'll have the same for the members of the audience.
Oh, I think so. It's really incredible. And I think it also shows the power of media as storytelling in the classroom for our students. And really, it just has been such a joy and privilege to spend my evening with all of you. And I want to give a special thanks to Rachel and Joe, our friends from BRI. Thank you for joining us tonight, for bringing such a great perspective on ways to teach elections and imparting your wisdom to this incredible Zoom room full of amazing teachers. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Hopefully we can get to some tonight, but now I'm going to turn it back over to Sue.
Great, thanks so much. So here again, everyone, is pbslearningmedia.org, and we encourage you to explore all that it has to offer. Here are some other collections we have that might be of interest to you. Maybe you have other collections on PBS Learning Media that you would like to share. You could put those in the chat. You might be interested in Deadlock, an election story that is currently streaming on pbs.org. And this film brings together a diverse panel of thought leaders to talk through a real life scenario about an election and the ethical dilemmas it raises. And they model critical thinking and compromise and civil dialogue. We're very excited to announce our next webinar, which will be with our partners from StoryCorps, and will feature Jason Reynolds, author and activist, who will speak on the power of storytelling for civics education. And we could not be happier that NCSS is in our hometown of Boston this year. If you're coming to NCSS, please come by and say hi to us at one of our presentations, at our booth in the exhibit hall, or you can come to our open house at our studio at the Boston Public Library. The library is just a short walk from the conference center, and we'll have lots of giveaways and great speakers for you to enjoy. Here are some details about that event at the public library. And even if you aren't able to attend NCSS, you're more than welcome to join us at our Studio Cafe and hear from American Experience, our education team. You can enjoy refreshments and get lots of swag and much, much more. And please give us feedback on this webinar by filling out this survey at this bit.ly address. And once the survey is complete, you'll be able to download a certificate of attendance, and the survey will close 2 weeks after this webinar. Thank you so much for coming this evening.